Hello, BookTube. We're continuing my chapter-by-chapter read-along of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings that I sort of stumbled into just a bit. The original plan was for my nominal co-host, David Wiley, and Tony from An Erudite Adventure, to read through the Two Towers in blocks of chapters, a block per week. But I ignored that and quickly settled into a pattern of reading one chapter a day. And I've just been continuing to do that, and it has been delightful. For me, a lot of you have said so too. Oh, there's the bee. There's the little baby. A lot of you have said also that it has been delightful, so I'm just going to continue. Certainly, I haven't had a reading experience like this in a while with this book, so it's worthwhile to me. And we have just passed the climactic battle chapters in the first half of The Return of the King, which is basically split into two halves. One is the adventures of our heroes on the battlefield in citadels, and the other, that we haven't got to yet, is the entirely separate adventure of the hobbit Frodo and his servant Sam on their way into Mordor to destroy the one ring of power right under the nose of the Dark Lord Sauron. We are dealing now, in the chapters that we're reading now, we're dealing with the battlefield action, with not even the slightest rumor of what's going on in that other plot line. We'll be getting to it. It's coming soon. But we have just passed a couple of climactic scenes of action. The charge of the Rohirrim, the siege of Minas Tirith, the defeat of the Lord of the Nazgul by Éowyn and Merry the Hobbit. We've encountered a great number of things. We've seen Aragorn take control of the Black Corsair fleet, aided by the army of the dead, which he accumulated by taking the paths of the dead. We've seen the death of King Theoden. We have just recently seen the death of the steward of Gondor. Gondor, after all, it's an ancient and mighty kingdom of men that has been waiting for the return of their king, hence the title of this part of the book, for centuries. And they've had a ruler that whole time, but the ruler is a steward only. He might have the powers of a king, but he doesn't call himself a king. He says instead that he's waiting for the king. And what most of the people in Gondor don't know is that the king is right on their doorstep. Aragorn, one of the main characters in the book, and one of the members of the Fellowship of the Ring, in the part of the book that we will be reading last instead of first, is actually the hereditary heir to Gondor. And he is with the forces of our heroes on the battlefield. He was engaged in the fighting. And now the fighting is over. The great captain of the Nazgul has been unexpectedly defeated. The Corsair fleet has been unexpectedly defeated. Our heroes have won a marginal victory. They have lifted the siege of Minas Tirith, destroyed a mighty ally, a mighty servant of Sauron, and dispersed a great number of his coerced slaves. They've given themselves a tiny amount of breathing space. And when Tolkien gives you that kind of moment, he explores it. He doesn't just say it and then move on the way so many contemporary writers would. Instead, he gives us falling action sequences. He's been mocked for this by writers who don't have a tenth of his talent. And this chapter that we're doing today is the Houses of Healing, and it is one of those chapters. Because as one of the old folk ladies of Gondor says, in the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. But the king is a figure of fable, so she's just reciting an old piece of folklore. She has no idea that the king is actually present. But I don't know of a non-sassy way to put this. Aragorn wants to enter Minas Tirith, his capital city, with the appropriate amount of fanfare. He wants to make an official entrance. He doesn't want to just creep in, especially if his ownership of the city, his rulership of the kingdom, is contested. Now, everyone around him tells him that his kingship is not contested. The person who contested it was the old steward, Denethor, who is now dead. The new steward is Denethor's son Faramir, who is unconscious. He was wounded and is one of the people in the Houses of Healing, basically in hospital. In lieu of Faramir, Gandalf has given control of the city to Prince Imrahil, who will not be known to readers who only know this story through Peter Jackson's movies, because he removes Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. He's a somewhat nebulous character. We don't ever get any interior dimensions from him, but he plays a couple of major roles in this third part of the book. And although he is technically in charge of Minas Tirith, he admits that Aragorn is his liege lord, and that I'm not contesting anything. No one is contesting anything, but still Aragorn says no. I'll pitch my tent outside the city, and I will wait. Plenty of time later for an official entry of the returned king, if we all survive. And precious little point to doing it if we don't. But Gandalf hears that old folk woman, that old nurse, say that line from folklore, and realizes that there might be a bit of truth to it, because as we've seen, there isn't a quasi-supernatural element to Aragorn, and maybe to the heirs of Isildur just in general. Gandalf goes to fetch Aragorn, who puts on a cloak so that he's just by himself. He's not in the head of a retinue. He's not riding, a massive horse or flower petals or anything like that. And he creeps into the houses of healing in order to dispense with healing. It turns out that he does have that ability, but we're not 100% sure that it isn't just herb lore that he learned in Rivendell from Elrond, who he admits in this chapter is the master of this sort of thing. And we've already seen Elrond save Frodo from the edge of death, from an ensorcelled weapon. And it's quasi-sorcery that we're dealing with now. Eowyn suffers a broken arm, but it's clear that what's ailing her is at least as much supernatural as otherwise. Same thing with Faramir. Same thing even with the little hobbit, although they are 10 times more resilient than normal people would think they would be. Whether there's any supernatural element to it or not, Aragorn dispenses with healing to our major characters. He recalls Faramir from the supernatural days that he's in. He recalls Eowyn from the supernatural days that she's in. He recalls. He dispenses this healing quasi-anonymously and then creeps back out of the city. And that's it. That is the Houses of Healing. That is all that happens in this chapter. We don't advance the plot at all. We just make sure that a couple of, by now, readers' favorite characters are going to live. That's all. There's a neat bit of psychological insight when Aragorn is talking about Eowyn. Keep in mind, Aragorn forbid her to come to war. She came to war and fought the Witch King of Angmar on her own, in disguise. And she confessed to Aragorn before that she was raging against the sexist predispositions of her time, that because you're a woman, you won't go to war. You will stay and tend and guard and help and that sort of thing. She's impatient about that. And Aragorn knows it, and he has a degree of sympathy. But he mentions here, who knows what she spoke to the darkness, alone in the bitter watches of the night, when all her life seemed shrinking, and the walls of her bower closing in about her, a hutch to trammel some wild thing in. That's pretty good, pretty insightful about Eowyn. It doesn't really excuse that you didn't let her come along, but she had her moment. She helped to strike down the foremost enemy of Gondor at the moment. She helped to win the day. And she and Faramir are brought out of peril, and we know that they're going to live and be fine. And then Aragorn puts his hood up and sneaks back out of the city. And that's the whole of the chapter. It's well done. You just have to acclimate yourself to Tolkien's storytelling habits, because he likes these falling action chapters. He doesn't like to give a climax and then just take a deep breath and move on. He likes to move you up the hill and then back down, relatively at the same pace. So we had another one of those chapters next. The next chapter that we have is called the Last Debate. It's one of my favorite expository chapters in The Lord of the Rings, second only to the Council of Elrond. So I'm going to give it a bit of depth, but that's not until the next time. I'm going to leave it for today at a fairly brief video, because there isn't much that happens in this chapter. So we'll wrap this up here. That is, we're going on with the Return of the King next time. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.